Sunday morning in Millfield, Ohio started like any other in October 1975. The leaves were turning golden brown and falling gently to the ground. 8-year-old Rebecca Thompson woke up early and put on her favorite blue dress with white flowers. She loved going to Sunday school at the First Baptist Church downtown. Rebecca lived with her parents, David and Linda Thompson, in a small white house on Maple Street. David worked at the local factory making car parts. Linda stayed home to take care of Rebecca and her baby brother Tommy, who was only 2 years old. The Thompson family had lived in Millfield for 5 years, and everyone in town knew them as good, honest people. That morning, Linda made pancakes for breakfast while Rebecca played with her doll named Annie. Rebecca always took Annie everywhere she went. The little girl had bright blonde hair that Linda braided every morning and big blue eyes that sparkled when she smiled. Rebecca was known around town for being friendly and polite to everyone she met. At 9:30, David walked Rebecca to church like he did every Sunday. The First Baptist Church was only 6 blocks from their house. It was a tall brick building, with white columns and a bell tower that could be seen from anywhere in town. Pastor William Hayes had been the minister there for 3 years. He was 42 years old with brown hair and kind brown eyes. Everyone in Millfield respected Pastor Hayes because he was always helping people in need. Rebecca ran into the Sunday school classroom where 12 other children were waiting. The teacher was Mrs. Dorothy Miller, a sweet older lady who had been teaching Sunday school for 20 years. The children learned Bible stories and sang songs together. Rebecca loved the story about Noah and the animals on the big boat. After Sunday school ended at 11:15, most of the children went home with their parents. But Rebecca stayed behind to help Mrs. Miller clean up the classroom. She always liked to help adults with their work. Rebecca put the crayons back in the box and stacked the chairs while Mrs. Miller wiped down the tables. Mrs. Miller finished cleaning and said goodbye to Rebecca at 11:45. She saw Rebecca walk toward the main church door where Pastor Hayes was standing. The pastor smiled and waved at Mrs. Miller as she got in her car and drove away. This was the last time anyone would see Mrs. Miller that day. Pastor Hayes was talking to Rebecca near the church entrance. Several people walking by saw them together. The pastor was holding some papers and pointing toward his office inside the church. Rebecca was nodding and smiling like she always did when adults talked to her. Mr. Tom Bradley was walking his dog past the church around noon. He saw Pastor Hayes wave goodbye to Rebecca from the church steps. Rebecca was carrying her doll Annie and walking toward home on Main Street. She turned the corner onto Oak Street and disappeared from view. This was the last time anyone would see Rebecca Thompson alive. At 12:30, Linda Thompson started to worry. Rebecca was always home by 12:15 for Sunday lunch. Linda called the church, but no one answered the phone. She called her neighbor, Mrs. Rose Adams, to ask if she had seen Rebecca walking home. Mrs. Adams said she had not seen the little girl. By 1 o'clock, both David and Linda were very worried. David drove his blue pickup truck around the neighborhood looking for Rebecca. He stopped at the church and found it empty and locked. He drove to the park where Rebecca sometimes played but did not find her there either. Linda stayed home in case Rebecca came back. At 2 o'clock, David called the Millfield Police Department. He talked to Officer Jerry Phillips, who took down all the information about Rebecca. Officer Phillips said children sometimes got lost or went to visit friends without telling their parents. He told David to keep looking and call back in 2 hours if Rebecca was still missing. David and Linda spent the afternoon driving around town and asking everyone they met if they had seen Rebecca. The ice cream man said he had not seen her. The lady at the grocery store said Rebecca had not been in her shop. Even old Mr. George Wilson, who sat on his porch all day, said he had not seen the little girl walk by. As the sun started to set around 6 o'clock, more people joined the search. David's brother Mike came over to help. Linda's sister Carol brought her husband and teenage sons. Neighbors from Maple Street walked through the nearby woods calling Rebecca's name. Everyone in Millfield knew something was very wrong. At 7 o'clock, David called the police again. This time, Detective Frank Morrison came to the Thompson house. Detective Morrison was 55 years old and had been solving crimes in Millfield for 25 years. He was a tall man with gray hair and a serious face. He asked David and Linda many questions about Rebecca and wrote everything down in His notebook. Detective Morrison organized a bigger search party. Police officers, firefighters, and dozens of volunteers spread out across town. They had flashlights and called Rebecca's name in the growing darkness. Pastor Hayes joined the search and helped coordinate the volunteers at the church. He seemed very concerned about finding Rebecca and prayed with the Thompson family. The search continued until midnight, but no one found any sign of Rebecca. David and Linda could not sleep that night. They sat in their kitchen drinking coffee and hoping their daughter would walk through the front door. Linda held Rebecca's favorite stuffed rabbit and cried quietly, while David stared out the window into the dark night. Monday morning brought more searchers and more questions. Detective Morrison interviewed Mrs. Miller about the last time she saw Rebecca. He talked to Tom Bradley about seeing the little girl leave the church. He questioned Pastor Hayes about his conversation with Rebecca near the church entrance. Pastor Hayes told Detective Morrison that Rebecca had asked him about joining the children's choir. He said they talked for only a few minutes before she walked home. The pastor seemed upset about Rebecca's disappearance and offered to help the police in any way he could. On Tuesday morning, a volunteer searcher made a terrible discovery. Tom Bradley was walking through the woods behind the church cemetery with his search group. His dog started barking and scratching at some fallen leaves under a big oak tree. When Tom brushed away the leaves, he found Rebecca's body. The little girl was still wearing her blue dress with white flowers. Her doll Annie was lying beside her. The peaceful look on Rebecca's face made it seem like she was just sleeping. But Rebecca Thompson would never wake up again. The innocent child had become the victim of a horrible crime that would haunt Millfield for decades to come. The news of Rebecca Thompson's death spread through Millfield like wildfire. By Wednesday morning, everyone in the small town knew that the sweet 8-year-old girl had been murdered. People locked their doors and kept their children close. No one could believe that such a terrible thing could happen in their quiet, safe community. Detective Frank Morrison arrived at the crime scene before sunrise on Wednesday. The woods behind the church cemetery were now filled with police tape and officers taking pictures. Dr. Patricia Wells, the county medical examiner, was already there examining Rebecca's body. She was a serious woman with short gray hair who had been doing this job for 15 years. Dr. Wells told Detective Morrison that Rebecca had been dead for about 3 days. The cause of death was clear, but she would not share the details with anyone except the police. She carefully collected evidence from Rebecca's clothes and body. Every small piece of hair, fabric, or dirt might be important for catching the killer. Detective Morrison started making a list of everyone who needed to be questioned. He wrote down the names of all the church members, Sunday school teachers, and anyone who was near the church on Sunday. The list was very long because the First Baptist Church had over 200 members. The first person Detective Morrison interviewed was Mrs. Dorothy Miller, the Sunday school teacher. She sat in the police station with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Miller told the detective that Rebecca was always a good helper and never caused any trouble. She explained that Rebecca stayed after class to clean up the classroom like she often did. Mrs. Miller said she left Rebecca with Pastor Hayes around 11:45. She saw them talking near the church entrance before she drove home. The Sunday school teacher could not think of anyone who would want to hurt the innocent little girl. She kept saying it must have been a stranger who came to town and did this terrible thing. Next, Detective Morrison spoke with Margaret Collins, the church secretary. Margaret was 60 years old and had worked at the church for 10 years. She knew everyone in the congregation and kept track of all the church activities. Margaret told the detective that Pastor Hayes was a wonderful man who loved children and always helped families in need. Margaret said she was not at the church on Sunday because she only worked during the week. But she knew that Pastor Hayes always stayed late on Sundays to prepare for the evening service. She could not believe that anyone would think the pastor had anything to do with Rebecca's death. Tom Bradley came to the police station that afternoon to talk about finding Rebecca's body. Tom was a quiet man who worked at the hardware store downtown. He lived alone with his dog Rex and spent most of his free time walking in the woods. Tom said he knew those woods very well and had never seen anything suspicious before. Tom told Detective Morrison about seeing Pastor Hayes wave goodbye to Rebecca on Sunday. He was sure it was around noon because he always took Rex for a walk at the same time every day. Tom said Rebecca looked happy and normal when she left the church. She was carrying her doll and walking toward home just like any other Sunday detective. Morrison decided he needed to talk to Pastor Hayes again. This time he asked the pastor to come to the police station for a formal interview. Pastor Hayes arrived on Thursday morning wearing his best suit and carrying his Bible. He looked tired and sad about Rebecca's death. Pastor Hayes told Detective Morrison that he had known Rebecca since her family joined the church 3 years. Oh. He said she was a bright, cheerful child who always paid attention during his sermons. The pastor explained that Rebecca had asked him about joining the children's choir on Sunday. They talked for only a few minutes before she walked home. When Detective Morrison asked about the 30 minutes between Sunday school ending and Tom Bradley seeing Rebecca leave, Pastor Hayes said he was in his office preparing his evening sermon. He claimed that Rebecca came to his office to ask about the choir and then left immediately. The pastor seemed nervous and kept looking at his hands while he talked. Detective Morrison asked Pastor Hayes if anyone could confirm he was in his office. During that time, the pastor said his wife Carol could verify that he came home right after Rebecca left and spent the afternoon working on his sermon. Carol Hayes was a quiet woman who rarely spoke to anyone outside the church. On Friday, Detective Morrison interviewed Carol Hayes at the parsonage next to the church. Carol was 40 years old with brown hair and green eyes. She seemed very upset about Rebecca's death and worried about how it was affecting her husband. Carol told the detective that William came home around 12:15 on Sunday and worked on his sermon all afternoon. Detective Morrison noticed that Carol seemed unsure about the exact time her husband came home. When he asked her again, she said it might have been 12:30 or even 1 o'clock. Her story was different from what Pastor Hayes had told him. This made the detective start to wonder if the pastor was telling the truth. The detective decided to search Pastor Hayes' office at the church. He got a search warrant from Judge Robert Miller on Friday afternoon. When he arrived at the church with 2 other officers, Pastor Hayes was waiting for them. The pastor said he had nothing to hide and wanted to help catch Rebecca's real killer. Pastor Hayes' office was a small room with a big wooden desk, bookshelves full of religious books, and a comfortable chair for meeting with church members. Detective Morrison and his team looked through every drawer, book, and paper in the office. Behind some books on the top shelf, they found something that made Detective Morrison very suspicious. Hidden in the back of the bookshelf was a small wooden box. Inside the box were several photographs of young girls from the church, including one of Rebecca. The pictures showed the girls in their Sunday dresses at various church events. By themselves, the photos seemed normal. But it was strange that Pastor Hayes had hidden them in his office. Detective Morrison also found Rebecca's hair ribbon in the pastor's desk drawer. It was the blue ribbon that Linda Thompson had tied in Rebecca's hair on Sunday morning. When Detective Morrison showed the ribbon to Pastor Hayes, the pastor's face turned white. He claimed he had never seen the ribbon before and had no idea how it got in his desk. The discovery of the hidden photos in Rebecca's hair ribbon made Detective Morrison believe that Pastor Hayes was lying about what happened on Sunday. But he still needed more evidence to prove that the respected pastor was actually a killer. The investigation was just beginning, and Detective Morrison knew it would be very difficult to convince the people of Millfield that their trusted pastor could do such a terrible thing. Detective Frank Morrison knew he could not focus only on Pastor Hayes. Good police work meant looking at all possible suspects before making an arrest. Even though the hidden photos and hair ribbon looked very bad for the pastor, Morrison had to be completely sure before accusing a respected man of murder. On Monday morning, Morrison got a phone call from Mrs. Betty Wilson, who lived on Oak Street. She said she had seen a strange man walking near the church on Saturday afternoon. The man had long, dirty hair and wore old clothes. Mrs. Wilson said she had never seen him in Millfield before and he made her feel uncomfortable. Morrison drove to Oak Street to talk with Mrs. Wilson. She was an elderly woman who spent most of her time watching the neighborhood from her front porch. Mrs. Wilson described the stranger as being about 30 years old with a beard and a limp in his left leg. She said he was carrying a brown paper bag and looking around like he was planning something bad. The description matched a man named Eddie Martinez, who had been arrested in the next town over for stealing food from a grocery store. Martinez was a drifter who traveled from place to place looking for work. He had been sleeping in an old barn outside Millfield for about a week before Rebecca's murder. Detective Morrison and Officer Jerry Phillips drove out to the barn to look for Martinez. They found him sleeping on some old hay with empty beer bottles around him. Martinez was exactly what Mrs. Wilson had described: dirty hair, old clothes, and a limp from an old injury. When the officers woke him up, Martinez seemed scared and confused. Martinez told the detectives that he had been drinking heavily all weekend and could barely remember what happened. He admitted to walking around town on Saturday looking for work or food, but he swore he had never been near the church and had never seen Rebecca Thompson. Martinez seemed genuinely shocked when Morrison told him about the little girl's murder. Morrison brought Martinez to the police station for more questioning. A polygraph expert from the state police came to give Martinez a lie detector test. The test showed that Martinez was telling the truth when he said he did not kill Rebecca. Morrison also found 3 witnesses who saw Martinez drinking at a bar in the next town on Sunday afternoon when Rebecca disappeared. With Martinez ruled out as a suspect, Morrison turned his attention to other possibilities. Several parents had called the police station to report concerns about Walter Johnson, the janitor at Rebecca's elementary school. Johnson was 55 years old and had worked at the school for 8 years. Mrs. Sarah Davis said Johnson had made her 10-year-old daughter feel uncomfortable by staring at her and asking personal questions. Another parent, Mr. Jim Roberts, said Johnson had offered to give his daughter a ride home from school several times. The parents said Johnson always seemed to find reasons to be around the young girls at school. Morrison interviewed the school principal, Mrs. Helen Carter, about Walter Johnson. She said Johnson was a quiet man who did his job well and never caused any problems. But she admitted that some teachers had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him. Mrs. Carter said she had never received any formal complaints about Johnson's behavior. Morrison brought Johnson in for questioning on Wednesday afternoon. Johnson was a thin man with gray hair and thick glasses. He seemed very nervous when Morrison asked him about Rebecca Thompson. Johnson said he knew Rebecca from school, but had not seen her since Friday afternoon when classes ended. When Morrison asked Johnson where he was on Sunday, the janitor said he was at home watching television all day. But Johnson lived alone and had no one to confirm his story. Morrison noticed that Johnson kept touching his face and looking away when asked direct questions about Rebecca. Morrison decided to search Johnson's small apartment above the hardware store. With a search warrant, Morrison and 2 officers looked through Johnson's belongings. They found several school yearbooks with pictures of young girls circled in red ink, but they did not find anything that connected Johnson directly to Rebecca's murder. The case became more complicated when Morrison received a phone call from Indiana. A woman named Nancy Williams said she had read about Rebecca's murder in the newspaper. Williams told Morrison that Pastor Hayes had been the minister at her church in Indianapolis before coming to Millfield. Williams said Pastor Hayes had been asked to leave their church quietly after several parents complained about his behavior around their daughters. Williams's own daughter Katie had told her that Pastor Hayes made her feel scared during private counseling sessions. The church leadership decided it was better to let Hayes leave quietly, rather than create a scandal. Morrison called the church in Indianapolis to verify Williams' story. The former church secretary, Mrs. Ruth Anderson, confirmed that Hayes had left under suspicious circumstances in 1972. She said there were whispers about inappropriate behavior, but nothing was ever proven. The church wanted to avoid publicity and let Hayes find another position elsewhere. This information made Morrison realize that Pastor Hayes might have a history of problems with young girls. Morrison contacted police departments in other towns where Hayes had worked before. He discovered that Hayes had been a minister at 3 different churches in the past 10 years, leaving each one after only 2 or 3 years. Morrison decided to bring in FBI agent Michael Cooper to help analyze Pastor Hayes's background and behavior. Cooper was an expert in criminal psychology who had studied many cases involving people who hurt children. Cooper reviewed all the information Morrison had gathered about Hayes. Agent Cooper told Morrison that Hayes showed signs of being a manipulator who used his position as a pastor to gain trust and access to victims. Cooper said predators often moved from place to place to avoid suspicion when people started asking questions about their behavior. The FBI analysis made Morrison more convinced that Hayes was responsible for Rebecca's death. But he still needed more concrete evidence to make an arrest. The hidden photos and hair ribbon were suspicious, but might not be enough to convince a jury that the respected pastor was a killer. Morrison decided to interview more church members to see if anyone had noticed strange behavior from Pastor Hayes. He talked to the youth pastor James Miller, who said Hayes sometimes spent too much time alone with young girls during church activities. Miller said he had mentioned this to the church board, but they dismissed his concerns. The investigation was becoming more focused on Pastor Hayes, but Morrison knew he was running out of time. The longer the case went on without an arrest, the more pressure he felt from the community and his superiors. Everyone in Millfield wanted justice for Rebecca Thompson, but Morrison had to make sure he had the right person before making an arrest that would destroy an innocent man's life. By the winter of 1976, Detective Frank Morrison felt like he was hitting a brick wall. He had interviewed over 50 people and followed dozens of leads, but he still did not have enough evidence to arrest anyone for Rebecca Thompson's murder. The pressure from the community was getting stronger every day. The people of Millfield were scared and angry. Parents walked their children to school and picked them up every afternoon. Nobody let their kids play outside alone anymore. The hardware store sold out of door locks and window alarms. Everyone wanted to know why the police had not caught Rebecca's killer yet. Morrison's main suspect was still Pastor William Hayes, but the evidence against him was mostly circumstantial. The hidden photos could be explained as innocent church pictures. The hair ribbon in his desk was suspicious, but Hayes claimed someone else must have put it there. Morrison needed something stronger to convince a judge to issue an arrest warrant. The District Attorney Robert Clark met with Morrison several times during the winter. Clark was a careful lawyer who did not like to prosecute cases unless he was sure he could win. He told Morrison that the evidence against Pastor Hayes was interesting, but not strong enough for a murder conviction. Clark said they needed physical evidence or a witness who saw Hayes with Rebecca. Morrison tried different approaches to build his case. He brought in Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the state police to help interview witnesses again. Rodriguez was known for getting people to remember details they had forgotten the first time. But the new interviews did not reveal any important new information. Rodriguez spent a week going through Pastor Hayes' background more carefully. She called every church where Hayes had worked and every school he had attended. Rodriguez found a pattern of Hayes leaving positions under unclear circumstances, but no one would admit that he had done anything seriously wrong. In March 1976, Morrison got permission to tap Pastor Hayes' phone to see if he would say something incriminating. For 2 months, police listened to Hayes' conversations with his wife, church members, and friends. Hayes talked about feeling hurt that people suspected him of such a terrible crime. He never said anything that suggested he was guilty of murder. The main phone tap did reveal that Hayes was under tremendous stress. He talked about having trouble sleeping and losing weight from worry. Hayes told his wife Carol that he was thinking about leaving Millfield because so many people looked at him with suspicion. Carol encouraged him to stay and fight to clear his name. Church attendance at First Baptist dropped significantly during 1976. Many families found other churches to attend because they felt uncomfortable around Pastor Hayes. The church board held several meetings to discuss whether Hayes should take a leave of absence until the case was solved. Board member Robert Anderson supported keeping Hayes as pastor. Anderson was a successful businessman who had known Hayes for 3 years and believed he was innocent. Anderson said the church should not abandon their pastor just because some people had suspicions without proof. But other board members were worried about the church's reputation. Eleanor Price, whose husband was a local judge, said the continuing suspicion was hurting the church's ability to serve the community. She thought Hayes should step down voluntarily until his name was cleared. The Thompson family was growing more frustrated with each passing month. David Thompson met with Detective Morrison every few weeks to ask about progress in the case. David could not understand how someone could murder his daughter and just disappear without leaving any trace. Linda Thompson was having an even harder time dealing with Rebecca's death. She rarely left the house and cried every day. Linda blamed herself for letting Rebecca walk home alone from church. The family doctor prescribed medication to help Linda sleep, but nothing could take away the pain of losing her little girl. In June 1976, the Thompson family made the difficult decision to move away from Millfield. David found a job at a factory in Columbus, Ohio, about 2 hours away. They could not stand living in the town where Rebecca had been murdered, especially when her killer was still free. Before leaving Millfield, David Thompson held a press conference outside the police station. He asked the community not to forget about Rebecca and to keep supporting the police investigation. David said he still believed that someone in Millfield knew what happened to his daughter and urged them to come forward. Detective Morrison continued working on Rebecca's case throughout 1976 and 1977, but he was also assigned other investigations. A series of break-ins kept him busy during the summer. In the fall, there was a hit-and-run accident that killed a teenager. Morrison found himself spending less and less time on Rebecca's case. In December 1977, Morrison announced his retirement after 27 years with the Millfield Police Department. His last official act was to organize all the evidence from Rebecca's case and write a detailed report for whoever would take over the investigation. Detective Karen White was assigned to handle Morrison's old cases when she joined the department. In January 1978, White was 28 years old and had worked for the state police for 5 years before coming to Millfield. She was known for being very thorough and not giving up easily on difficult cases. White spent her first month reviewing Morrison's files on Rebecca's murder. She read every interview report and studied all the evidence. White agreed with Morrison that Pastor Hayes was the most likely suspect, but she also saw why there had not been an arrest. The case needed new evidence or a new approach. White decided to interview Pastor Hayes one more time. She wanted to see if 3 years had changed his story or made him more willing to tell the truth. But when she called the church to set up the meeting, she learned that Hayes was no longer there. The church secretary told White that Pastor Hayes had resigned in November 1977 and moved to Florida with his wife. Hayes had told the church board that the continuing suspicion was making it impossible for him to serve effectively as their pastor. He said he needed a fresh start somewhere else. White contacted the police in Tampa, Florida, where Hayes had moved. The Tampa detective said Hayes was working as a volunteer at a small church and seemed to be living quietly with his wife. They agreed to keep an eye on him but said there was no evidence of any suspicious behavior. By 1979, Rebecca Thompson's case file was officially moved to the cold case section of the Millfield Police Department. Detective White still reviewed the case occasionally and followed up on any new tips that came in, but without fresh evidence or witnesses, there was little she could do to move the investigation forward. The case that had once consumed the entire police department and terrorized the community slowly faded from daily conversation. New families moved to Millfield who had never heard of Rebecca Thompson. The First Baptist Church called a new pastor who worked to rebuild the congregation's trust and attendance, but Rebecca's murder was never completely forgotten. Every few years, a newspaper reporter would write an article about the unsolved case. True crime enthusiasts discussed it on internet forums. And somewhere in Florida, William Hayes continued his quiet retirement, carrying whatever secrets he might have about that terrible Sunday in October 1975. Detective Amanda Foster had always been fascinated by cold cases. When she joined the Millfield Police Department in 2018, she asked if she could spend some of her free time reviewing old, unsolved murders. Her captain, James Miller, gave her permission to look through the files as long as it did not interfere with her regular duties. Foster was 32 years old and had been a police officer for 8 years. She had studied criminal justice in college and was especially interested in how new technology could help solve old crimes. Foster believed that many cold cases could be solved if investigators took another look with fresh eyes and modern tools. The Rebecca Thompson case caught Foster's attention immediately. She read through Detective Morrison's original files and Detective White's follow-up reports. Foster was impressed by the thorough work both detectives had done, but she wondered if DNA testing might reveal evidence that was impossible to detect in 1975. In January 2019, Foster got permission from her captain to officially reopen Rebecca's case. The first step was to find out what physical evidence still existed after 44 years. Foster went down to the evidence storage room in the basement of the police station to look for Rebecca's case files. Foster was amazed to discover that the evidence from 1975 had been carefully preserved. Rebecca's clothing was stored in sealed plastic bags in a temperature-controlled room. Hair and fiber samples were kept in small containers with detailed labels. Even Rebecca's doll Annie was still there, exactly as it had been found next to her body. Foster contacted Dr. Kevin Martinez at the Ohio State Crime Laboratory to ask about testing the old evidence with modern DNA technology. Dr. Martinez was excited about the possibility of solving such an old case. He explained that DNA testing had improved dramatically since the 1990s and could now detect genetic material that would have been impossible to find decades earlier. In March 2019, Foster drove to Columbus to deliver Rebecca's clothing and other evidence to Dr. Martinez. The scientist told her that the testing process would take several months because the DNA samples were very old and degraded. Martinez warned Foster that there might not be enough genetic material left to get a clear result. While waiting for the DNA results, Foster decided to research what had happened to all the people involved in the original investigation. Detective Morrison had died in 2003. Detective White was retired and living in California. Pastor Hayes was still alive and living in Tampa, Florida, with his wife, Carol. Foster called the Tampa Police Department to check on Hayes's current situation. Detective Paul Johnson told Foster that Hayes was now 78 years old and suffering from early signs of dementia. Hayes spent most of his time at home and occasionally volunteered at a small community church. Johnson said there had never been any complaints about Hayes's behavior in Florida. In August 2019, Foster got the call she had been hoping for. Dr. Martinez told her that the DNA testing had found genetic material on Rebecca's dress that did not belong to the victim. The DNA was from saliva and skin cells, probably transferred during a struggle. Martinez said the genetic profile was clear enough to compare against other samples. Foster immediately thought of Pastor Hayes, but she knew she needed a sample of his DNA to make a comparison. She could not just ask him to provide DNA without revealing that he was still a suspect in Rebecca's murder. Foster needed to find a way to get Hayes's genetic material without him knowing about it. Foster contacted FBI agent Sarah Bennett, who specialized in cold case investigations. Bennett had successfully solved several decades-old murders using genetic genealogy, a new technique that used public DNA databases to identify suspects through their family connections. Bennett explained that they could upload the unknown DNA profile to a genealogy database to look for genetic relatives. If they found relatives, they could build a family tree and identify possible suspects. This method had been used to catch the Golden State Killer in California and dozens of other cold case suspects. In September 2019, Bennett uploaded the DNA profile from Rebecca's case to several genealogy databases. Within 2 weeks, they got a hit. The unknown DNA matched with several people who had uploaded their genetic information to trace their family history. Bennett worked with genealogy expert Dr. Jennifer Adams to build a family tree from the DNA matches. Dr. Adams was able to trace the genetic connections back to a common ancestor in the 1800s. From there, she worked forward through the generations to identify all the possible descendants who could have left the DNA on Rebecca's clothing. The family tree analysis pointed to one main suspect, William Hayes. The DNA profile was consistent with someone from Hayes's family line, and Hayes was the only person from that genetic family who had been in contact with Rebecca Thompson in 1975. Foster knew she still needed to confirm that the DNA actually came from Hayes himself. She could not arrest a 78-year-old man based only on genealogy analysis. Foster needed a direct comparison between Hayes's DNA and the evidence from the crime scene. Foster and Agent Bennett flew to Tampa in October 2019 to begin surveillance of William Hayes. They needed to collect something that Hayes had touched so they could extract his DNA for comparison. This type of surveillance had to be done very carefully to avoid violating Hayes's constitutional rights. Foster and Bennett followed Hayes for 3 days, learning his daily routine. Every morning, Hayes walked to a small cafe near his apartment for coffee and a newspaper. He always sat at the same table by the window and spent about an hour reading and drinking coffee from a white ceramic mug. On the 4th day, Foster and Bennett went to the cafe before Hayes arrived. Bennett posed as a customer while Foster waited outside. When Hayes finished his coffee and left the cafe, Bennett retrieved the mug he had been using. The mug had Hayes' fingerprints and saliva on it, which would provide perfect samples for DNA testing. Dr. Martinez completed the DNA comparison in November 2019. The results were conclusive. The DNA from Rebecca's clothing matched the DNA from Hayes' coffee mug. After 44 years, forensic science had finally identified Rebecca Thompson's killer. Foster felt a mixture of excitement and sadness when she got the results. She was thrilled to have solved the case that had haunted Millfield for so long, but she was also heartbroken thinking about Rebecca and her family. Foster wished David and Linda Thompson were still alive to see their daughter's killer finally identified. Foster called David Thompson's brother Mike, who still lived in Ohio. Mike was now 68 years old and had never stopped hoping that Rebecca's case would be solved someday. When Foster told him about the DNA match, Mike started crying on the phone. He said his brother David had died in 2015, still believing that someone in Millfield knew what happened to Rebecca. The next step was to arrest William Hayes and charge him with Rebecca's murder. Foster coordinated with Tampa police and the FBI to plan the arrest. They had to be careful because of Hayes' age and medical condition. Foster did not want the arrest to become a media circus that would hurt the investigation. On December 15, 2019, Foster and Agent Bennett knocked on the door of Hayes' apartment in Tampa. Hayes answered the door wearing pajamas and seemed confused about who they were. When Foster showed him her badge and told him he was under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Thompson, Hayes just stared at her with blank eyes. Hayes was taken to the Tampa jail where he was held until he could be transported back to Ohio. His wife Carol was shocked by the arrest and told reporters that her husband had never hurt anyone. Carol said William's memory was getting worse every day and she did not believe he was capable of murder. The arrest of William Hayes after 44 years made national news. Cable television shows featured the case as an example of how genealogy was revolutionizing cold case investigations. Foster found herself giving interviews to reporters from around the country who wanted to know how the case was finally solved. William Hayes sat in the Millfield County Jail looking much older than his 78 years. His hands shook as he tried to drink water from a paper cup. The dementia that had been slowly affecting his mind made it hard for him to understand why he was in jail. Sometimes he forgot where he was and asked guards when he could go home to his wife Carol. Detective Amanda Foster visited Hayes several times during his first week in custody. She wanted to give him a chance to confess and tell the truth about what happened to Rebecca Thompson 44 years ago. Foster hoped that Hayes would want to clear his conscience before it was too late. At first, Hayes denied everything. He told Foster that he had never hurt Rebecca and could not understand why anyone thought he was a killer. Hayes said the DNA evidence must be wrong because he was a man of God who would never harm a child. He seemed genuinely confused about why he was being accused of such a terrible crime. But as the days passed, Hayes began to have moments of clarity where his memory seemed clearer. During one of these moments, Foster showed him photographs of Rebecca and reminded him about that Sunday in October 1975. Hayes stared at Rebecca's picture for a long time without saying anything. Public defender Mark Stevens was assigned to represent Hayes because he could not afford his own lawyer. Stevens was a young attorney who had only been practicing law for 3 years. He knew that defending an elderly man with dementia accused of child murder would be the most difficult case of his career. Stevens met with Hayes and his wife Carol to discuss the case. Carol insisted that her husband was innocent and said the UA police were making a terrible mistake. She told Stevens that William had been a good pastor and husband who had spent his whole life helping people. Carol begged Stevens to fight the charges and prove her husband's innocence. The prosecutor assigned to the case was Rachel Turner, the district attorney for Millfield County. Turner was known for being tough on violent crimes and had successfully prosecuted many murder cases during her 15-year career. She studied all the evidence against Hayes and believed she had a strong case that would finally bring justice to Rebecca Thompson. Turner met with Rebecca's surviving family members to prepare them for the trial. Mike Thompson, David's brother, was now the family spokesperson since both of Rebecca's parents had died. Mike told Turner that the family had waited 44 years for this moment and hoped that Hayes would be convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The preliminary hearing was held in February 2020 to determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. Judge William Carter reviewed the DNA evidence, the testimony from the original investigation, and the genealogy analysis that led to Hayes's identification. Judge Carter ruled that there was probable cause to believe Hayes committed the murder. The case moved toward trial. Something unexpected happened. During a meeting with his lawyer in March 2020, Hayes suddenly began talking about Rebecca Thompson. Stevens later said it was as if a dam had broken in Hayes's mind, and all the memories he had been hiding for decades came flooding out. Hayes told Stevens that he remembered Rebecca coming to his office after Sunday school that October day in 1975. He said Rebecca had asked him about joining the children's choir, and he had invited her into his office to talk about it. But then something had gone terribly wrong. Hayes said he could not control himself when he was alone with Rebecca. He admitted that he had touched her inappropriately, and when she tried to run away, he had grabbed her to stop her from telling anyone what he had done. In his panic and rage, Hayes had killed the innocent little girl who had trusted him. Stevens was shocked by his client's confession. He immediately contacted Prosecutor Turner to arrange a plea bargain meeting. Stevens knew that Hayes's confession would make it impossible to win at trial, so the best option was to try to negotiate a sentence that would avoid the death penalty. Turner was willing to accept a guilty plea in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. She did not want to put Rebecca's family through the trauma of a trial if it could be avoided. Turner also knew that Hayes's age and medical condition made it unlikely he would live many more years even in prison. The plea hearing was scheduled for April 15, 2020. Hayes was brought into the courtroom in a wheelchair because his health had deteriorated significantly during his months in jail. He wore an orange jail uniform and his white hair was uncombed. Hayes looked like a frail old man rather than the dangerous killer he had once been. Judge Carter asked Hayes if he understood that he was pleading guilty to the murder of Rebecca Thompson. Hayes nodded and said in a weak voice that he understood. When the judge asked him to explain what he had done, Hayes told the court about luring Rebecca into his office and killing her when she tried to escape. The courtroom was packed, with people from Millfield who had followed the case for decades. Many of the original investigators were there, including retired Detective Karen White, who had flown in from California. Former church members sat next to Rebecca's family members, all of them finally learning the truth about what happened that terrible Sunday. Mike Thompson was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement before Hayes was sentenced. Mike stood at the podium and looked directly at Hayes as he spoke. He told the court about the pain his family had endured for 44 years, never knowing who had killed Rebecca or why. Mike said his brother David had died in 2015, still hoping that Rebecca's killer would be caught someday. He talked about how Linda Thompson had never recovered from losing her daughter and had lived with guilt and sadness until her death in 2016. Mike said the family was grateful that Hayes had finally been caught, but wished it had happened while Rebecca's parents were still alive. Detective Foster also spoke at the sentencing hearing about the importance of never giving up on cold cases. She said that advances in forensic science meant that many old cases could now be solved if investigators were willing to take another look at the evidence. Foster dedicated the successful prosecution to all the detectives who had worked on Rebecca's case over the decades. Judge Carter sentenced William Hayes to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He told Hayes that his crimes were particularly heinous because he had used his position as a pastor to gain access to his victim. The judge said Hayes had betrayed the trust of his entire community and destroyed the lives of Rebecca's family. Hayes was transported to the Ohio State Penitentiary to begin serving his sentence. Because of his age and medical condition, he was placed in the prison's medical unit where he could receive proper care. Prison officials said Hayes would likely spend the rest of his life in a hospital bed rather than a regular cell. Carol Hayes stood by her husband throughout the legal proceedings, but the stress of the case took a serious toll on her health. She developed heart problems and was hospitalized several times during the trial process. Carol moved to a nursing home in Tampa after William was sentenced because she could no longer take care of herself. The resolution of Rebecca Thompson's case brought some comfort to the people of Millfield who had lived with the unsolved murder for so long. Parents who had kept their children close for decades finally felt safe letting them play outside again. The First Baptist Church held a memorial service for Rebecca, which was attended by hundreds of people. Detective Foster received recognition from the FBI and several law enforcement organizations for her work on the case. She became a leading advocate for using genetic genealogy to solve cold cases and traveled around the country, training other investigators in the new techniques. 18 months after his sentencing, William Hayes died in the prison medical unit. He was 79 years old and had been suffering from pneumonia and complications from his dementia. Hayes died without revealing whether he had harmed any other children during his years as a pastor. The death of William Hayes marked the final chapter in a case that had haunted Millfield for nearly half a century. Rebecca Thompson could finally rest in peace knowing that her killer had been brought to justice. The little girl who had loved Sunday school and helping others would be remembered not as a victim, but as the catalyst for advances in forensic science that helped solve many other cold cases. Detective Foster kept a photograph of Rebecca Thompson on her desk as a reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed. The case proved that with determination, new technology, and a refusal to give up, even the oldest and coldest cases can eventually be solved.